The college football playoff has not disappointed, and the Texas Longhorns are definitely a team that has contributed to that. And now they find themselves in the semifinals, and we're going to talk about how they beat the Ohio State Buckeyes. It was a very entertaining game from a fan perspective, the Arizona State game, but I think Texas fans obviously would have liked a little bit more of a comfortable win. But there are definitely some things that they learned from that win. There are things that they did really well, and there are things that they can do better for this game. And Texas has done a really good job of keeping their composure in tough moments. And part of that is Quinn Ewers, Steve Sarkisian. Things have gone wrong for Texas. And I think one of the best things that Texas has done is they haven't freaked out when things aren't going right. When Arizona State was making a comeback, they did not freak out. They did not panic. They did not worry about what was going on. They held on at times. I think there are times where Arizona State was just dominating the game, and Texas just had to hang on and find a way to win. And they did exactly that in overtime of that game, and now they find themselves one game away from playing it for a national championship. And I think that there is something to keeping your composure in these big moments. There are a lot of times where teams just lose it. I mean, you look at what Ohio State did to Oregon. That was a team that jumped out to a big lead, and Oregon wasn't prepared for what Ohio State was doing, and it got out of hand quickly. That's what can happen if you're not ready for the moment. And Texas, was ready right off the bat, jump out to that 14-0 lead, and then Arizona State essentially storms back in the second half. And throughout the entire thing, I think Texas was prepared for a battle. And obviously, if you're a Texas fan, you probably wish that this was a little bit more of a blowout and not necessarily as close as it was, but nonetheless, you're still here. You still found a way to win, and sometimes that's what you need to do. You're playing really good teams, and you need to find a way to win these football games. Now, they find themselves as a 6-point underdog heading into this game at the time I'm recording this, so there's definitely a different level of pressure. They're not really, a 6-point underdog is significant at this point in the college football playoff. Ohio State is playing really well. Texas obviously has had its ups and downs, so maybe that creates a different perspective for Texas, and maybe that's what will help them a little bit more. Take it, relax a little bit, play a little bit more loose, and I think that there are definitely some big questions, and there's some keys to the game that will help Texas win this football game. The first one's going to be creating pressure. Now, this is something they did relatively inconsistently against Arizona State. They had 6 tackles for loss and 3 sacks. This is a group that can get after it, and that's going to be a big key at facing this Ohio State team. From tackles for loss, sacks, just getting hurries on Will Howard, those are going to be things that make it easier for them to win this game. And this is a group that can do it. You look at what we've seen from Texas so far this year. When they have been playing really well, it's because they're creating pressure, they're being disruptive, and they're ultimately finding ways to make the other team's life very difficult. Creating pressure is going to be a big thing for them. I think finishing is going to be a big key as well. You saw what happened against Arizona State, and yes, they kept their composure, but this was the Texas team that did not finish in the second half. That was the Texas team that let Arizona State hang around, and they did not play very well, and running the football wasn't very good either. They started out obviously with that 14-0 lead. They only scored 10 points in the second to fourth quarters. So you're looking at a team that needs to play better, that needs to finish down the stretch, because this is an Ohio State team that is very capable of beating this Texas team and finding ways to finishing plays, finishing drives. Those are going to be big keys for Texas if they want to win this football game, or even just take a lead and stick with it. That's going to be a big key. And another part of that is how do you find an answer for Jeremiah Smith? Now, one of the biggest matchups this weekend is Jahdae Barron against Jeremiah Smith. Jeremiah Smith absolutely torched the Oregon Ducks this past weekend. He's having a monster college football playoff, and Texas obviously knows that he is a big player that has he's a big frame. He's a very talented player that's going to be in college football for another couple of years. He is going to be a massive problem for everybody, and right now he is Texas's problem. The Longhorns must find a way to slow him down. If that's Jahdae Barron, if they're going to bracket him, whatever they're going to do, they have to find an answer for him. He is very talented. Even you throw Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, G. Scott had a big play for Ohio State in the Oregon game in the Rose Bowl. So there's definitely plenty to worry about if you're a Texas fan in that passing attack. And Jeremiah Smith is obviously the biggest one. I think that's something that people are going to talk about all week. How do you cover Jeremiah Smith? What certain things can you do to take him out of the game? Now, you can't get too comfortable with that because, again, Ohio State is too talented in the passing attack. They have other options. So how are you going to combat that? What are you going to do to kind of make Will Howard a little uncomfortable? Because so far, Will Howard in 2 games against Tennessee and Oregon has looked extremely confident. And part of that is creating pressure, like we talked about earlier, getting to hit in his face and getting pressure on him, finding ways to mess up his timing, mess up his rhythm. Those are going to be big keys if Texas wants to win this game. And we'll kind of keep going into that. We'll actually go into the Ohio State players to watch. We talked about Jeremiah Smith, 7 catches for 187 yards, 2 touchdowns. Oregon did not have an answer for him. And part of that was the lack of size in the secondary. It's kind of hard when you have to cover a guy who's 6'3", 215. You just don't have a ton of players like that can step up and play that type of way, play with that kind of size. Texas is going to have to figure out a way to slow him down. The other thing is that the run game has to step up as well, the rush defense. And this defensive line just has to play better than it did. Cam Scatabo, I think, struggled early against Texas, and that helped Texas take that early lead. But then once he got more comfortable, he's a very physical runner, and that's something they're going to see against Ohio State. Travion Henderson and Quinshad Judkins had a pretty good game combined, 179 yards, 2 touchdowns. Both of them can be physical. Both of them can break away from you. So it's going to be kind of a repeat. Now, they have a little bit more speed than Cam Scatabo does, but it's still going to be a physical approach. And Ohio State's offensive line is going to be physical. This defensive line for Texas must figure out a way to be disruptive. We talked about creating pressure. Slowing down that rushing attack is going to put more pressure onto the passing attack. It's going to put more pressure on Will Howard, who, again, playing very well right now. 17 of 26 for 319 yards and 3 touchdowns in the Rose Bowl, and he is someone who could be a major problem for Texas if they're not careful. A guy who had a big game on the defensive side of the ball, Cody Simon, and now they're not going to use Cody Simon the same way they did against Oregon. They don't really need to spy Quinn Ewers. Yes, Quinn Ewers can run, but I'm interested to see what his role will be. He had a big game against the Ducks. He made life very miserable for Dylan Gabriel and that Oregon team. And he's a guy who's, coached by a really good coaching staff and has played really well this year. He had a huge game, obviously, and part of that was also the defensive line. JT Tuimoloau is playing like the player that we thought he was capable of, and that's a guy that Texas has to worry about. Now, granted, Texas' offensive line, they've taken a couple of dings. They've had some injuries, so that's something to keep an eye on. But they are definitely capable of handling this Ohio State defensive line. JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, Tyleik Williams, Ty Hamilton. That's a good group that's going to be tough to block. But if there's a group that can handle that, it is the Texas Longhorns. So you feel like you have a pretty good situation if you're Texas. You feel like you're in a good spot, and you have the players to combat what Ohio State brings to the table. And we'll talk about those players for Texas here. Matthew Golden has been phenomenal. I think that without Isaiah Bond, they were kind of looking for that go-to guy, that deep threat. And Matthew Golden started out as, kind of the slot guy who's going to be your possession receiver. And he's quickly turned into that deep threat. And he's done a really good job. He did a really good job against Arizona State. 7 catches for 149 yards, 21 yards per catch and a touchdown. He is someone who, coming from Houston, we didn't really know what to expect. Would he be capable of playing at that level? And he has shown that he is more than capable of handling that level of expectations. He is the go-to guy for Quinn Ewers, who had a decent game against Arizona State, 20 of 30 for 322 yards and 3 touchdowns. I honestly think when you look at that stat line and you look at what Texas did, that could have been a lot better. That could have been a monster performance. But you have to hand it to Arizona State. They played really well. They found ways to disrupt Texas and what they were trying to do. That was something that Texas didn't really have an answer for. And part of it was their inability to run the football. Quintrevin Reisner struggled. 18 carries for 45 yards. Jaden Blue is essentially non-existent. He only had a handful of touches. That is something that has to get better. If you are going to compete against Ohio State's defense, you have to be able to run the football. The passing attack can't do everything. The the rushing attack has to be better. We talked about the defense, what it needs to do. We've seen a number of guys step up. Colin Simmons, though his stat line doesn't look great, was really disruptive for Texas against Arizona State. He had a number of plays where we were talking about him, and it's still crazy that he's a true freshman. Trey Moore had a pretty good game, 2.5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks. Vernon Broughton had a couple of big plays. Bill Norton, you look at Ethan Burke. There are plenty of talented players on this defensive line. They have to step up. They have to be disruptive, find ways to get to Will Howard and slow down this Ohio State offense. Johnny Barron, we talked about him. More tackles maybe than you'd want him to have with 11, led the team in tackles against Arizona State. This will be a little bit of a different challenge. He is going against, obviously, Jeremiah Smith, one of the best, if not the best wide receivers in college football. He is a phenomenal talent, but Johnny Barron is going to the NFL for a reason. It'll be fun to see how those two stack up. It's going to be a fun matchup. And Texas, like I said, is very capable of winning this football game. There's just certain players that need to either step up and do better, players that need to continue what they're doing, and there's certain keys that if Texas meets those requirements, they're going to be just fine. Otherwise, it's going to be another confident game for the Ohio State Buckeyes, but Texas is definitely on a roll here, and they are very capable of winning a close game. They're going to keep their composure in that close game, but they have to do certain things better if they're going to make that happen.